Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Next Big Pod. We've got a special midweek episode this week. We're joined once again by former matchmaker, manager, and I don't want to say wino. I'm going to say lowlife, former lowlife. The emphasis on former. Charles Farrell joins us once again after the fantastic show we had back in January. I know many of the listeners have been clamouring for this since. We left on something of a cliffhanger. Charles, thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you so much for inviting me again.
We thought it was a good time to sort of cover a little bit of maybe some stones that were left unturned before, but also it's actually a fairly big weekend of boxing, so we can get onto that a bit later. We've been somewhat starved of action in terms of notable fights since we last spoke to you. So we've got on the panel, we've got Andy, Brian, Sam, and Alex as well. So it won't just be me talking to any concerned listeners. Charles, I thought a good place to start would be with the cliffhanger you left us with last time, which was obviously the Ali and Liston fight. And we had a lot of angry messages from listeners who wanted to know the end of the story, essentially. So could you give us a sort of historical framing of that fight, if that's all right?
Of course. Let's start by saying it's not a fight, it's two fights. Both fights were fixed. But let me go back briefly before the first fight took place. Let me talk about Liston a little bit. The thing with Sonny Liston was that he was a much, much better heavyweight than everybody else. Any of his contemporaries. He was really an unbeatable heavyweight. And to my mind, he was the best heavyweight who ever lived. That's debatable, of course, but I think at his best, he was pretty untouchable. The thing about Liston, of course, was that he was an entirely mind-controlled fighter. He was not involved in fixed fights, but he was controlled by a guy named Frankie Carbo, who controlled a lot of boxing, fixed a lot of fights, primarily worked with middleweights and welterweights. The problem with Liston was that he had effectively already wiped out the division. Are you getting this okay? I see I'm breaking up.
Yeah, Charles, it's going a little bit choppy. Sorry, I'm not sure why. It was fine for about 30 seconds. I think it's if people other people on the panel have been turning video on and off, which can sometimes sort of chop it up. Try again now.
Okay.
No, it's still quite. Sorry, Charles, I might need to get you to drop off and call back in if that's all right. If you leave close this window and then reopen the Twitter link I sent you. Sorry.
Let me try. Next time, let me try that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Brian, fuck's sake.
It was nothing to do with me.
As soon as you turned the video on, he dropped off. Literally the second you did it.
Just turn it off. You're eating fucking chow mein. No one
wants to look at you. You shouldn't.
Fuck you, look at your fucking picture. You look like a fucking honking bastard smoking a fag. You mind fuck change it?
Fuck's sake.
I think he looks lovely.
Thank you.
You give me the bulk.
You give me the poke. Big fat slobbery mess.
Look, I showed you. It's not only fat, but you've got a big fucking squid bob. He'd head.
He'd.
Forehead. He'd. Is this live?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fuck's sake.
We can edit this out.
Okay, how's this?
Perfect.
It is good. Okay.
Yes, that's great. Please continue.
Here were the problems with Sonny Liston. He had already effectively wiped out the heavyweight division. He'd beaten everyone he was supposed to beat. He had knocked out Cleveland Williams twice quickly. He had knocked out Zora Foley very quickly. He'd won a convincing decision over Eddie Machin, who didn't engage him. So he'd knocked out Floyd Patterson twice in a round each. So there was really literally no one for him to fight, and more importantly, no one wanted to see him fight. It's important to know that Liston at this point was close to 40. So he was an old guy who nobody wanted to see, and he was controlled by gangsters. the smartest move that could be made for him at this point was to make it, rather than stringing him along with one title defense a year against someone who he would knock out in a couple of rounds and no one would pay to see and no one could bet on, to cash him in. When he fought Ali the first time, the odds were 8-1 in his favor. So the idea was to have him lose, bet very, very heavily, which the mob did, at 8-1, which was an enormous score. They also controlled the rematch, so there was an immediate rematch where Sonny was also an 8-5 favorite. So they not only got to make a fortune on the first fight in terms of betting it at 8-1, they got to do the whole thing over again at obviously less propitious odds, but they got to make another score. So instead of waiting for 10 years until Sonny Liston got so old that he couldn't fight, or until somebody actually could beat him, which eventually happened when he was no longer the champ, when he fought Leotis Martin, it made much more sense to cash in enormously by having him lose, which is what they did.
And is that situation? I suppose, yeah, you could argue there are parallels in modern eras in terms of having a fighter. I mean, you hate to think about it this way, but perhaps something similar might end up happening with Golovkin, perhaps it would have done if he'd been around at the same sort of time. When you have a guy who's almost deemed unbeatable, and you simply can't kind of make money off him because you can't get the opponents.
Well, I'm not sure how translatable that is for a couple of reasons. One, boxing was a very different business in terms of public appreciation back then. There was one heavyweight champion, so there was a lot attached to being the heavyweight champ. So every fight was a sort of significant fight. With Golovkin, that's not quite as true, since in fact, although he's the best middleweight in the world, there are other middleweight champs. Additionally, there are challenges for him, whether or not they're available or whether or not he chooses to take them. That's another thing. But I think he could probably fight Alvarez for big money in a real fight. It doesn't need to be fixed. He could move up. I don't know that it's wise for him to do it, but he could. So there are alternatives. With Liston, literally nobody wanted to see him fight, and it was just it was sort of the only expedient way to make money from him.
Right. So as you said, a very unique situation in the history of the sport, really.
I think it was, because you not only have this guy who is vastly superior to everyone else, he's also someone who, in terms of the era in which he fought, didn't have a lot of currency as a popular figure. I mean, nowadays, a guy like Sonny Liston would make fortune because there's the kind of countercultural market that would allow for him. But at the time, that didn't exist. So there was only sort of one exemplar for what a heavyweight champion was supposed to be, and that was a good guy. And that didn't work for Liston. So, I mean, it was by far the smartest business move that anyone could have made for him. Is to let him lose Ali.
And hugely cynical, as we can see, but also, like you say, very smart. Charles, you're breaking up a little bit again. I'm not sure if it's your connection, or I don't think it's any of us, because a couple of us have dropped off the call to sort of free up some room. But can you try again now?
Okay. I'm using.
That's much better. That's much better.
It is, okay. I'll keep going.
Yeah. So we'll have to soldier through. Yeah.
Soldier through, indeed. Yeah.
Sorry. Please continue. Yes. So Liston sort of going into the Ali fights was in a very unique position, and not necessarily a good one.
Well, or a very good one, depending on how you want to see the Ali fights. I mean, these are fights that he's not going to get hurt. Nothing's going to happen to him. And he can control the situation to the extent that there's some ambiguity about what's happening in the first fight, which allows for the second fight to have some degree of public interest. So I think all the signs were very, very favorable to Liston, except if you want to see Liston as a historic fight figure, where of course his reign at the top was incredibly short and insignificant. And so I think historically that sort of ruins him and in terms of how he's regarded, compared to other great heavyweights. I personally think he's the best of them all, but he doesn't tend to be in the argument in the top one or two, and he should be. What might be more interesting is seeing this through the framework of Ali, who's then allowed to become an icon, where if the fights were real, he may well not have won them. And so you have to think, how do we reconfigure history if he loses to Liston? Now, obviously he's one of the greatest one or two or three heavyweights who ever lived, and you can make a strong argument for him having been the greatest heavyweight who ever lived. But what happens if he loses to Liston the first time out? And it really does reconfigure the whole history of boxing in general. And when you take Ali into account as a cultural icon, it reconfigures him as a cultural icon. He becomes just another fighter.
And it was really his first major step up, wasn't it, as a young heavyweight?
It was his first major step up. And although he looked good, he looked very good prior to that fight, there are certainly question marks. I mean, he'd already been down twice in two different fights. And really, in one of the fights, the Henry Cooper fight, was very lucky to have been knocked down at the end of a round.
Yeah, he was, being British, we're very proud of that punch that we as a nation managed to land on him. But yeah, he was very badly hurt, and it was with just a few seconds left, wasn't it?
Right, that's right.
So, in terms, tell us a bit more about kind of the scheming behind the scenes. Did either of the fighters know?
Well, obviously, Liston knew.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
But it's interesting as to who knew and who did not know. Ali assuredly did not know, and in fact didn't know about the second fight, which is why he was so appalled when it became obvious to him in the ring that Liston just fell down. He was outraged because he felt he'd been made to look foolish. He recovered from that very, very quickly, and by the time he left the ring, he had a cover story. But at the time it took place, he was furious. There were people from from Liston's camp who knew, but not everybody did. His corner kind of half knew. Willie Reddish knew, but I'm not sure if anyone else did. Obviously, his management team, Carbo and Blinky Palermo and those guys all knew, the guys who bet. I think, and I know I'm going to be vilified for this, I'm quite certain that Chris Dundee knew, who was promoting, which means that Angelo Dundee knew. And I know I'm going to get a lot of heat for that one. My guess is that the Muslims did not know. There was no reason to bring them into the picture, and I know for a fact that the wise guys who handled Liston held the Muslims in contempt.
Right, and of course, there's no sense in bringing more people than is necessary in on the conspiracy, is there, if you're trying to keep it under wraps?
No, that's right. Unless there's a real reason to do it, you want to keep it as quiet as possible. And unlike nowadays, where a lot of fixers, for some reason, feel the need to brag, these guys were businessmen, and they didn't talk about what they did. I mean, the reason that I know about it, and I can talk about this now because the person who told me is no longer alive, is I got it from Al Braverman. And Al Braverman was one of Liston's handlers for the second fight. He was sort of kept in close proximity to Sonny just to make sure that nothing awkward happened and nothing that wasn't supposed to take place took place. So Al explained the whole situation to me, and obviously it makes a lot of sense business-wise. And interestingly enough, Sonny really didn't do any more business until the very, very end of his life, where there was a mistake, which I can't go into.
Oh, really? Okay. Because obviously we kind of, you see Liston as this, or at least we do as, more distant observers, as this, on the one hand, completely unstoppable monster at his peak, but at the same time there's a sense of kind of wasted potential and being born in the wrong time for many reasons.
Well, I mean, there's certainly the argument to be made that he was born in the wrong time. I mean, for example, if he'd come up at the same time as Mike Tyson, I think he would have done every bit as well as Tyson in terms of the general public, and he was a much scarier figure and a much better fighter and a much more dangerous guy. I know that Tyson said, well, this is one guy I could never have beaten, and he's right about that. So I think with gangster culture and hip-hop culture and a lot of other things, Liston would have been a megastar had he been born, I don't know, 40 years later, 50 years later. But if you're looking at, if you're thinking about him in terms of wasted talent, predicated on the business decisions that were made for him, I think I have to disagree. He showed himself to be unquestionably the best heavyweight of his era, and he cashed out when there was no reason to stick around. So, I mean, again, it's a kind of anti-sports argument to be made, but I think it's a valid one.
Yeah, I suppose it's supremely cynical on the one hand, but also it's a kind of a personal triumph for him in terms of getting as much as he could get, and then exiting, when he was no longer kind of needed or could no longer maximize his earnings. Yeah, it's a sort of fascinating, unique situation to be in, I think.
I haven't seen it before or since. I mean, it's also, you have to take into account that there really wasn't anyone for him to fight. If there were fighters around, for example, he could have gone to Sweden and made a lot of money fighting Ingemar Johansson, but Ingemar Johansson wouldn't fight him. So, that was off the table.
He would have been past his, I'm trying to remember my heavyweight timeline. Johansson would have been past his prime by the time Liston was peaking, wouldn't he?
Well, Johansson retired right after he lost to Patterson the second time, and he never fought again. And although on paper he would have been seen as older than Liston, in point of fact, he was a good deal younger than Liston.
Yeah, yes, of course. We're sort of seeing a bit of a resurgence of the old forged identity papers, I think, with some of the Cubans coming through now, where we'll get on to the current heavyweights later, but yeah, none of us are really convinced by Luis Ortiz's stated age. But yeah, of course, Liston was a good deal older than he claimed to be, wasn't he?
Probably 10 or 11 years older.
Which makes his sort of athleticism and his prowess in the ring even more amazing, really.
Well, I mean, again, I think he's a very misperceived fighter. Step away from all the sociological and cultural, aspects of this. He was a perfect heavyweight. He could do everything. He could punch. He could box. He kept power until late in the fight. He could move inside, outside. He moved his head beautifully. I mean, it's interesting to note that when he lost the first fixed fight, the scorecards were even at the time that the fight was stopped. I mean, he wound up slipping a lot of Ali's punches without meaning to slip them. He was
Just
so.
sort of instinctively, or
Yeah, he was instinctively, and he was also such a beautifully trained fighter.
Charles, I've read a quote about Sonny Liston where he talks about Al Braverman. Hold on.
you
They
digging
asked,
out.
it was something about it was after the Chuck Wepner fight, and they said to him, "Is Chuck Wepner the bravest fighter you faced?" And he went, "No, but his manager is."
He did say that about Al Braverman.
Why would he say that? What would make him say that? Was he fond of Al Braverman, or was he not?
I think he was fond of Al Braverman to some degree, and I can't talk about this too much, but let me say what I can say about it. And you're all very, very bright guys, and your powers of deduction will kick in. As I said, Al Braverman was Liston's handler. He was the guy the mob had look out for Sonny Liston in the rematch. So obviously he knew Sonny Liston very, very well. Chuck Wepner was Al Braverman's fighter. He was the guy he managed and he trained. Al Braverman was one of the greatest boxing brains I ever knew. He knew a tremendous amount about boxing. Why would he put Chuck Wepner in with Sonny Liston? And I'll leave it at that.
Because didn't Wepner sustain like some horrible injuries in that fight and needed all sorts of stitches done to him?
He got, I think, 80 or 90 stitches, and I think it was it was very difficult for Sonny to not hurt him. I think it was. I think Sonny did his best.
If he caused him 80, 90 stitches, he could have done a better job.
I think he could have done whatever he wanted to do, but this is a difficult subject for me because some things happened, and again, I think I'm stuck. I like to be candid, and obviously everything I can talk about, I will talk about. But that fight is a fight I can't talk about.
Okay.
Which is, again, for bright guys like yourselves and your listeners, that's probably the information you needed to hear.
I'm sure we can, make sure all sorts of, we can infer all sorts from that. But thank you for sharing as much as you could. So if we fast forward, God, what would it be, 55 years or so? Obviously, it's quite a big weekend coming up for the UK heavyweights, and we've got Anthony Joshua challenging for a world title, not despite what his promoter might be saying, in his 16th fight, which by today's standards seems, remarkable that a guy, they're making a huge deal out of it in the UK. How green he is in terms of his record, at least, and the fact that he's already at world title level. I was wondering what your thoughts were on Joshua, if you've seen him fight, and if you how you sort of rate his chances moving forward.
I've seen most of his fights. Well, I mean, look, I think that he will certainly beat Martin on Saturday night, and he'll knock him out. And that's the first step to what I suspect is going to be a very, very lucrative title reign for Joshua. I guess the big question is, how good is he? And it's impossible to tell that yet. I mean, he does certain things quite well, and he does certain things poorly. But I think it's pretty well understood that that PBC has got some money problems, and Charles Martin is not making anybody any money, and he's being paid very, very well to come to the UK and fight against Anthony Joshua. I think the fight is on the level, but I think it's understood that Martin can't possibly win. Martin's a beginner.
Just to clarify that, I think the reports today are that he's on something like $8.5 million for the fight, which would make him surely one of the best paid American fighters this year, which is crazy when you think about it for such a novice.
Right, especially when you take into account the kind of money he made in his title winning effort, which has got to be at most an eighth that. So this is a cash in. This is a guy who nobody wants, who really can't fight very well, who if he fought other fighters would lose within a a defense or two for almost no money. His title is relatively worthless, except as a stepping stone for Joshua. There it has real currency. So, Joshua is a big guy. He's fundamentally pretty sound. I think he can punch some. His problems have to do with stiffness. It looks like maybe his chin isn't the best. He got hurt by White early in that fight and really didn't respond very well. But Martin doesn't respond well to being hit either, and Martin has got so many fundamental defects that I don't see how this is going to be much of a fight. So I guess the question is, where does Joshua go after Saturday? Boxing fans in the UK are very, very lucky right now because the big heavyweight fights can stay there, I think.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think the way we see it is that he's got sort of two routes to go down. I don't think there's any way he'd end up, going to Russia to fight Alexander Povetkin or anything like that. I think he's either aiming for Fury and to unify the division, or at least add some more belts together.
Right.
Or it's a David Hay fight.
Right. Absolutely.
Relatively meaningless. But we reckon that would sell. I think we're talking 100,000 tickets quite easily for that fight because they're two absolutely huge names. And we don't want to be too cynical, but we suspect we know which way his promoter will take him.
Well, those are the two fights. There's no question about it, and they're both, monumental fights. But I'd be curious to pick your brain as to which order you think he will take them in.
Well, anyone want to jump in on that?
I think he'd take Hay before Fury.
But would he see Fury as a more winnable fight though? That's the thing.
I don't think he sees either one of them winnable, which is the whole reason why he's went after Charles Martin. Well, let's get this right here. He was offered the Fury fight in the first place when they all turned around and says they would knock him out. And what did they do? No, he's not ready, but he'll knock him out. They manufactured Fury getting stripped to this, and Herzog went out his way and admitted that he spoke to Dover. Dover deliberately forced this push bid, hoping that Glasgow would win, and Glasgow's first defence would have been against Joshua. So this was all manufactured.
Yeah, Charles. Eddie Hearn admitted about a month ago that he had a sort of what's the word? A preliminary deal with main events if Glasgow had won as well. So he was really covering himself to get whoever won that fight with Martin and Glasgow for the vacant belt.
Joshua was going to WBC route. He was going. This is Eddie Hearn over the back. He was going the easiest route. He says that he could beat everybody. He didn't want to go near Vladimir Klitschko. And then when Fury won, he still didn't want to go near them. They were and all of a sudden they switched for Wilder and then going Charles Martin, because we obviously know this isn't a world title fight. I'm not going to recognise him as a world champion. He's certainly not in my eyes. The only time I'm going to recognise him as a world champion is if he either beats Vlad, if Vlad beats Fury in the rematch, or if Fury beat Fury. That's Fury's belt. I don't care who wins fights after this and holds that belt. That's Tyson Fury's belt. He won it. He got it stripped because of politics. So I don't care. Joshua's not going to go near Fury or Hay anytime soon. The only reason he'll go near David Hay is if this year he looks really old, and then next year they'll make that fight.
There's your answer, Charles.
Okay, no, well, I think there's no question. There's only one legitimate heavyweight champion. I agree. It's Tyson Fury. He won the title. He won the title from the real champion. But I think it's probably important to see all of the titles as no more than tokens, playing pieces. So which ones do you annex first to maximize your earnings? So, the Charles Martin title doesn't mean much of anything, except that it's a token that Joshua will now have as a bargaining chip. Because at that point, every fight, aside from the fight with David Hay, can be seen as a unification fight, right? So you use that.
And I'm sure David Hay will find a way to pick up some regular belt or an interim thing, and then they can make that a so-called unification. And yeah, that I can see that coming to a very large stadium in the UK next year.
Well, Hay is the one guy who doesn't need to do it. I think Hay's the one guy who can get away with fighting just as David Hay. He's spent his whole career setting himself up for this kind of payday. I mean, he's just a great self-promoter. And I think that I agree that Fury is a much easier defense for Joshua. So my guess is it would be Fury first and Hay second, because there's one thing that we have to worry about. If you're Joshua's management, you've got to worry a little bit about what happens if a fast-moving, slippery guy like David Hay, who really does let his punches go and can punch, hits your guy on the chin. The one thing you know about Fury is he doesn't punch.
I actually think the opposite. I really do think the opposite. David Hay's put a bit of weight on, and he's not going to move as much anymore. And the whole reason he said that he's put weight on is because he wants to be a heavyweight. So he's want to kind of sit down in his punches more. He doesn't want to move about more. And I think one thing that's going to give Joshua problems is a guy that's going to move, which is basically the bugbear of a lot of British fighters and all that. As soon as they get in against boxers, they totally struggle, because more often than not, UK fighters only know how to fight one way.
But don't you think that I think the biggest concern Eddie Hearn and Joshua's management have is what happens when a big puncher can catch him, someone who's got fast hands. Charles Martin can punch a little bit, but he doesn't. His hands are like they're soaked in concrete. It's very, very slow puncher. Not the worst timing I've ever seen, but not fast hands compared to a guy like Hay.
Well, the other thing is that his punches are entirely predictable. Charles Martin, he does the same. He pushes out. He's got the right jab, and he pushes out a right jab, and then he pushes out a right jab, then he pushes out his left cross, and that's it. That's all he's got. This is his whole arsenal, and he throws no punches to the body whatsoever. So Joshua will see those punches coming, and I don't know if you know, in Martin's fights, he is completely susceptible to a lead right, and when he gets hit, he goes straight back. He has no survival instincts whatsoever. So, no, I agree with you. I think the real thing that you have to be wary about with Joshua is what happens when he gets hit on the chin. I really didn't like what happened in the second round of the White fight. I didn't like the way he responded to getting hit. I mean, he came back and he won the fight, and that's great. I mean, that says something about his heart, but
he stiffened up, didn't he, for a good few seconds? And
he did, and he didn't know what to do either. And Hay is an opportunist in the ring.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the reason why it would be so, a very exciting fight is that I do think Joshua is an excellent finisher when he's got a guy hurt, and I think Hay is also. So, one of them, they're not going to let the other one sort of off the hook if they do get them hurt. Sorry, Sam, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I kind of think that Fury would be a much harder fight for him, because it's the movement that I think will cause Joshua problems, because he's a bit rigid, a bit stiff. He comes forward, he goes backwards. I didn't see any lateral movement with him. Well, I'm really high on Luis Ortiz, and I think Luis Ortiz would be a nightmare for him.
Nobody's going to touch him. Nobody's going to get near Luis Ortiz. Luis Ortiz is the monster in the room.
Were you not a bit uninspired by the Tony Thompson fight? Because I watched it, and I am massively high on Luis Ortiz, and I didn't come away from it any more impressed than I was after. Well, a little bit less impressed than I was after the Brian Jennings fight. I kind of thought, although he won every round against Tony Thompson, who's an old, out of shape Tony Thompson, I think he could have got him out much quicker if he wanted to, and his offense looked really predictable. He was doing the same thing over and over again.
Well, I think one of the things that tends to be true of the Cuban fighters is they're so calm, and they're trained in a way that they just go about their business. And I think Ortiz in particular doesn't think in terms of what people necessarily want to see. So I found it was an impressive performance, but I think his liabilities showed up too, which is that he's not the hardest worker in the world. And I think what you saw in the Thompson fight was that he understood maybe 90 seconds into the fight that he had nothing to worry about. He could knock this guy out whenever he wanted, any way he wanted to do it. And for whatever reason, he doesn't seem to fight with the kind of urgency that people might want. But that doesn't make him less dangerous,
So a similar sort of thing to Rieger, then. If someone comes in purely to survive, he's quite happy just to let him survive.
That was the impression I got. I mean, I think after the first knockdown, he sort of sent the message that he needed to send. And, and he got in a little bit of work. I mean, I'd like to see him work harder. I'd like to see him be a little bit more decisive. But in terms of what he can do, there's nobody even close. And the fact is, although say what you want to about Tony Thompson, coming in out of shape and his age and all that stuff, he was able to do to Tony Thompson something that no one else had done before. I mean, he got him out of there faster than anyone.
See, I'm a fan of boxers, and I like people that don't waste punches. And if they don't need to throw a punch, don't throw a punch. And as much as I'm not a fan of Ortiz because he's tested positive, and I'd rather he wasn't in the sport of boxing. I do like watching him because he doesn't waste a lot of punches. He will just kind of throw when he knows he needs to. So, and for a big guy, he is quite good at moving about the ring. So, and he's quite good at parrying punches and odds. You see it in, I can't remember one of the fights it was. He can kind of change stance off it quick. See, for a guy that's really top heavy, he's really broad, but he can change his stance. So I don't know how he's going to get these fights right enough. I don't know how Golden Boy's going to get any champion to fight him, because I know this WBA tournament that's not going to happen. Fury's already told them I'm the champion and you'll need to fight each other before he's fight me. So I don't know how they're going to eventually try to get him some sort of world title, unless he goes a mandatory route.
What would you do, Charles, if Luis Ortiz was one of your guys you used to manage? How would you go about manoeuvring him into these shots? Because we can't see anyone taking him voluntarily.
I don't think that. I think it's very, very difficult. I think that you sort of have to shame people into fighting him, and that's, it has to be the court of public opinion more than anything else. I mean, why would you fight Luis Ortiz when you could fight Charles Martin? When you could fight, I'm trying to think. Who else you'd have to take on?
Well, like Wilder's done with Eric Molina and Johan Duhaupas and stuff like that. You'd fight them sort of guys as opposed
or
to
Lucas Brown. You could fight Lucas Brown. I mean, that's a walk in the park for anybody.
See, I think De La Hoya made a mistake with him though, because the only sanctioning body that really forces their mandatories is IBF. So I don't know why they just didn't go down that route instead of going. I mean, the WBA is probably one of the worst for trying to get mandatory sanctions. So he obviously knew the talent he had, and he obviously must have known how hard it was going to get fights. So I don't get why he chose the WBA, especially when it was Vlad that had the belt at the time anyway. So I don't understand.
Well, except that you can maneuver ratings so easily. It's they're all of the sanctioning bodies are very, very easy to move however you want to move them if you're moving money into their sanctioning fees. So I think with Ortiz, you take what you can get, and they somehow managed, somehow they got him a title, the WBA title, and
I think, Charles, it may be a case of him having to go to a place like Russia in order to sort of get a marquee win, or sort of take one of the fights that some of the others don't necessarily want.
Ustinov's not want to take that fight either. He's meant to be fighting him next.
Well, he's in the Rigo situation, isn't he, where his mandatories are, or his contracted opponents are already ducking him. Even when they have nothing to lose, they're still avoiding him. Very
right, amazing to me. Right, people. But the thing is, at some point, anybody will fight anybody if there's a economic incentive to do it. but that's just not going to happen with Ortiz. I mean, Wilder is going to go over to Russia to lose. Again, sort of similarly to the way that Martin is coming to the UK to lose. I mean, Wilder has proved to be an economic bust, and he's very, very vulnerable. So you might as well make some money from him.
And who's going to bid more on a purse than Ryabinski, who sort of averages about 15 million per heavyweight fight in purse bids? I think it's
just right. Obscene amounts.
I believe when it went to bids in February.
Right.
Right. So we still can't tell if that fight's completely signed, because I sort of see things being suggested but not confirmed, and I still get the impression that there could be another twist in the tail, and you might see Wilder ditch the belt or something.
They'd be crazy to have him do that. I mean, again, he's going nowhere, and despite all the early noise around him, that buzz has dissipated as he's become increasingly exposed. So it's risk putting him in with guys who can't fight, and still, there's still a real threat that he could lose, or fixing all of his fights, which, fixing against whom, right? At one point, what does it matter?
And is it the best investment, to spend all that sort of that time and energy on a guy who, like you say, hasn't really proven himself to be box office or generate huge money? Yeah.
And the thing is, of all the guys who are champion, Povetkin's not a bad fighter by any means, but he's a hot and cold fighter, and he's a methodical fighter. And so, although I don't think Wilder leaves Russia with the title, it's not completely out of the question that he could.
No, and I think it's not. I wouldn't say it was a 50-50, but it's a competitive fight. I don't think it will be a complete domination by either guy. I would favour Povetkin, but both guys have a chance to win and win potentially by knockout.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. You're right. I mean, Povetkin's been hurt before. He got hurt, against Klitschko, of course, and he got hurt with Huck. So you're right. I don't have a lot of confidence in Wilder's power, but I agree with you, Sam. I don't think it's a 50-50 fight, but I think it may be a 75-25 fight or an 80-20 fight. Certainly worth taking.
Yes, and I wouldn't say it was a mismatch, which maybe a year ago people would have worried that it might be. Charles, just moving on from the heavyweights slightly and sort of broadening out, you mentioned Lucas Brown earlier, and obviously we've had the news about his alleged drug bust that he's vigorously disputing at the moment. But although whether that's a legitimate complaint or not remains to be seen. And obviously we've had Ortiz, we've had question marks around Povetkin and his transformation in the last 18 months. Can I ask, going back into the history of your life in boxing, what's your relationship been with PEDs? Obviously not personally, but in terms of when did you first start to notice them, or was it ever something you had issues with in terms of the fighters you managed?
I mean, I had.
Well, obviously, please. I appreciate you don't want to say anything libelous or anything about your.
Well, we have the statute of limitations, so I'm pretty good.
Of course, yeah.
No, I mean I had fighters who used steroids. The idea when I was first made aware of PEDs, they were vastly different from what they are now, and so I haven't kept up on the kind of advances that have been made. It used to be that when I was managing fighters, guys were just using steroids, and the reason that they were using steroids is very different from why people use PEDs now, and it had to do with, again, size and marketing potential. So you saw, and it was almost exclusively true of heavyweights. So you saw guys like Holyfield who were 178 pounders, suddenly becoming these very muscular guys of about 210 or 215, but who had all kinds of problems as a result. I mean, they didn't help their fighting at all. In fact, they did them a lot of harm. And at one point, it was pretty epidemic among heavyweights. There were 7 or 8 of the top 10 heavyweights in the 1990s.
Do you think Michael Moore was another one?
That's a good question. I'm not so sure that he was. He was a pretty big kid. And, when he got up past 220 or so, he always looked flabby. So...
I was thinking Tommy Morrison, Charles, might have been.
Tommy Morrison, I know. As a matter of fact, I not only I know how he did. Interestingly enough, Tommy Morrison started using steroids because he was in a Rocky movie. And he didn't have the right body type prior to that. And so in order to make him more believable and more cinematically friendly, they put him on a steroid program, and he really fell in love with the way he looked.
And of course, I guess it was still ahead of the curve in terms of public consciousness of what steroids could, or what performance enhancing drugs could do. And I think when would you say you first noticed it amongst fighters? Would it have been the 1980s or even earlier?
I would say the late 1980s. I mean, it was a subject that was so primitive and so misunderstood, or it was so largely cosmetic to begin with. I mean, there were amateur programs that used it, and they used it in a way that the pros didn't. The pros used it for cosmetic enhancement. That was really it, to get themselves big muscles, to lose weight fast. I mean, you saw it with like Tyson after he came out of prison. He was 280 pounds or something like that, and then he juiced, and suddenly he's this ripped 220-pound guy to fight Peter McNeely. But that was largely the sole purpose, and fighters were getting hurt as a result. I mean, you had people like Holyfield had problems with their bodies busting down in many ways, heart issues, breakdown of their muscles, things like that. I think the reason that people use PEDs now is much more sophisticated, and the purposes to which they're used are very, very different than they were 30 years ago, which were really sort of the dark ages of PED use.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I can remember a conversation I had a couple of years ago when we were talking about, I think it was Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., and it was after the Andy Lee fight when he, famously refused to give a urine sample, just point blank refused, and then left the arena. And they, for some reason, it was Texas. They didn't follow it up for whatever reason. He was awarded the win. It wasn't a no contest, strangely. But and someone was saying, "Oh, he doesn't look like he's using steroids." And my answer was, "Well, he's a 6'2" guy who's managed to weigh in at 159 pounds while being, very muscular. He's look at the size of him compared to the guy he's fighting. That's the giveaway. It's not. You shouldn't look at his abs to see if he's using steroids. It's kind of so much more holistic than that. And I do think boxing fans generally are very. They're still stuck in the 1980s kind of mindset of what steroids do, and they'll say things like, "Oh, he doesn't have any knockouts. How can he be on steroids?" And you just think, it's not a Rocky film, ironically. Although, given your recent example, you don't juice in order to get sort of miracle power. So
no, not at all. No, I mean, now I think you juice primarily, for recovery more than anything else, and but I haven't seen the kind of enhanced performance that to me makes it a worthwhile enterprise. I'm sorry.
this isn't a heavyweight and this is more of a modern one, but do you not feel like Marquez in the fourth Pacquiao fight especially was obviously on something, because he looked, for a 40-year-old man, he was in extremely good condition. He had a spotty back, and he demonstrated power that he'd never shown at welterweight before.
His body type did seem to have changed slightly, which was odd.
You know, I hate to think that about him, because he's exactly the type of fighter you would think would have no need for it. I mean, you know, he's such a beautifully schooled, old school fighter, and Nacho Beristain is such an old school trainer. And, you know, there was nothing in terms of the way he fought that was any different from what it had been before. But, and of course, there's nothing that'll keep a 40-year-old man from being in extraordinarily good shape. That's not an issue either. And you can get muscular if you change your training habits. But, you know, Marquez is not a guy who would change his training habits in that way. Why should he? And I'm without accusing him, because he's a guy I really admire. His physical transformation seems odd to me.
I think, my own opinion, I think Anthony Joshua is taking some drugs, because if he turned pro, he's put on something, I think it's like at least 20 pound of muscle, but there's not a bit of fat on him. It's not as if he's done like a lot of people do, is like kind of put a bit of bulk on and then they cut the weight. He's just constantly stayed ripped, and he's absolutely fucking shredded, but at the same time he's bulked all this muscle on. And
I think sometimes with Joshua, it does look like his arms are his biceps are too big. He can't properly sort of torque his arms and you know, get the power in there, because his shoulders and his biceps just sort of block any type of speed. It's odd.
That's what it looks like to me too. Yeah, I mean, to his detriment. That's those kind of traps and biceps are going to do him a lot of harm at one point. They're going to undo him.
Yeah, and if you look at a guy like Ortiz, Charles, just going back to what you were saying earlier, you know, it's a guy who's clearly very, very fit, but he's not. He doesn't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger in terms of his upper body. But he's a guy who can clearly punch very hard and has. I think HBO always describe it as kind of a swimmer's body, in terms of that. That's what a boxer should look like. They shouldn't look like an NFL player, you know.
Well, Tyson Fury's a good example as well, I think.
Always in perfect shape.
So some of the guys with the like brutal one-punch knockout power, like Andy Lee, for example, he doesn't look in good shape really. Obviously, he looks fit and he looks athletic, but he's not muscle bound.
He looks very, very skinny, yeah. But it just proves that it's all about technique, doesn't it? Really, in terms of delivering a shot like that.
You know, it's technique, and it's also a kind of natural gift. Punching is a natural gift, and I mean, there is no physical type that, I mean, you get, you know, some of the greatest punchers who ever lived, you know, Carlos Zarate, you know, Lou Jenkins, they were these Alexis Arguello, these, you know, skinny guys.
And Nassim Hamed is obviously the big one in Britain, where he was nothing to look at, but obviously had ungodly power for a guy his size.
Right, well, and then you get guys who are built completely differently than that. You get guys like Burt Cooper, you know, or Lionel Butler, who are these big, you know, they have sort of undifferentiated mass, but there's no muscle tone. There's nothing that suggests, you know, any kind of, you know, it's like farm strength. It's a different type, you know, and they punch very, very naturally, and they can knock down a house.
Would you put a guy like Ray Mercer in that category?
Well, Ray Mercer was not a great puncher.
But he seemed to have sort of naturally very strong, I felt, especially sort of on the inside. He could sort of shove people around.
Very strong. But, you know, I mean, one of the strongest guys I've ever seen in boxing at 168 is Joe Calzaghe, you know, who has a very unimpressive upper body. But really sort of ungodly strength in ring strength, you know, usable strength. I mean, Ali, for example. I mean, we read recently on Twitter about what Ali would have been like, you know, if he'd been built like Anthony Joshua. And, you know, Ali, with the exception of maybe Foreman effortlessly moved everybody he was in the ring with anywhere he wanted to put them. He was just an incredibly strong guy. Larry Holmes, incredibly strong guy.
And I think
there's
a good modern example. I'm forever being told or I'm forever hearing from his opponents that Andre Ward is another one who's incredibly strong on the inside, and just he's not some huge a huge guy who's going to kind of overwhelm you physically, but he's just very, very strong and very difficult to kind of to budge and to shift backwards.
Unbelievably strong. I agree. Incredibly strong guy.
It was almost the first thing you hear from his opponents is was there anything surprising about what he did? And they say, no, he's just much, much stronger than he looks. I think Barrera said something similar. I can remember Carl Froch saying something to that effect after their fight. And obviously Froch was standing next to Ward, looked quite a lot bigger, but had a reputation as a strong, tough guy, but found he couldn't really shift the guy when he was sort of trying to shove him on the inside.
Right. Well, also, Ward has got just perfect balance. So I mean, he sets himself in a way that he's very, very hard to move. But I mean, guys like John Ruiz, who looked like nothing, I had a fighter I was managing who fought John Ruiz, and the next morning he said to me, I couldn't believe how strong that motherfucker was. And he didn't expect it. But it was true.
No, and again, he's never someone I would have thought, if someone said sum up John Ruiz in a few words, I don't think that strong would be one that I'd put in there. No, absolutely. Charles, can I ask, we've just had a perfect segue. You've sort of set yourself up for this, I'm afraid. I've noticed over the last few weeks, quite a lot of tweets having to defend, well, not defend, but explain your position on Kovalev and why you feel that there are certain kind of flaws and holes in his game. And talking about Ward, obviously that's the big fight that people want to make for later this year, and arguably the best fight that can be made in the sport at the moment. It would be Ward against Kovalev for the light heavyweight supremacy. So I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on the flaws you see in Kovalev and the problems you think he'll have down the line.
Sure, but let me start by saying I think Kovalev is a tremendous fighter. I think that he punches awfully hard, and he's a good boxer, and he's a smart guy, and I also think that John David Jackson is doing beautiful work with him. So he's a formidable character. I don't take him lightly at all. But what I see in him is that he fights scared. There's a rigidity. I know someone said to me, well, you're categorizing him as a Russian fighter or an Eastern European fighter, and that's not it at all. It's that there's a kind of hesitancy in everything he does in the ring, and to me, and this is based mostly on experience, so you could argue it pretty well. I think you could probably make a strong argument against what I'm going to say, because it's, as I said, predicated mostly on experience. That there's a rigidity and a hesitancy to him when he fights that shows me two things. One, he's not the most confident guy in the world, and the other thing is that he does not have a good chin. I mean, I'm confident about that he doesn't have a good chin. Even Bernard Hopkins, who can't punch at all at 175, hurt him twice in a fight where he was completely dominated. And again, he's a guy who, when he gets hit, there's a momentary freeze that takes place where his system short circuits. Now, he's really well trained and he recovers from it quickly. But I think he can be undone in two different ways. One, I think that he does not respond well to being hit, and if he's fighting a guy who's a real predator. And Andre Ward, although I don't know if people quite see this about him because of his style, is an absolute predator. He's a guy who sees weakness like a shark, and he responds beautifully to it. And also a guy like Andre Ward has got unquenchable confidence in himself. there's nothing you can do to make Andre Ward doubt himself. And I think when those two guys fight, all of Ward's positive attributes are going to come to light. And I think probably all of Kovalev's liabilities are going to be exposed.
So do you think really it could be a sort of career-defining fight for Ward in that sense, in terms of cementing him as a great?
Yes, I mean, I think Ward is a guy who has done everything that's been asked of him so far, and I think he has proven himself at 168 beyond any argument, and I think he's a strong guy, as we've said before. So I think that would be the defining fight for him at 75.
You mentioned about Kovalev's chin. You think it's a bit wobbly. What do you think of Ward's chin?
I think it's solid. He's been down a couple of times, mostly early in his career. But I think that's more a question of him making an adjustment into the pros. I think his chin will hold up. He doesn't have Julio Cesar Chavez's chin. He doesn't have Marvin Hagler's chin. But in that Super 6 tournament, he fought some guys who could punch. And I never saw him in anything close to trouble. Did you?
Nope.
No, not at all. I mean, Darnell Boone's put most people down, hasn't he? So
yeah.
He knocked a lot of good people down.
Darnell Boone can punch. Right. Yeah. Right.
He can't do much, but he can punch.
He can punch, right?
Another guy I've seen a lot of people say he fought scared. Do you think Roy Jones was another one who fought terrified, for example?
Can I tell a kind of lengthy story about Roy Jones?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. Roy Jones, let me be the first to say, Roy Jones fooled me. Okay, I thought that Roy Jones was one of the all-time greats, one of the best fighters I ever saw in my life, a guy who would have held up in any era. And I also thought he was going to be economically the guy who Floyd Mayweather turned out to be. A guy who was self-managed and would make a fortune and wouldn't be owned by anybody and would get out early with all of his faculties intact and really redefine how a fighter could manage himself. So, I thought a lot of him. When he was undefeated, I was talking to a friend of mine named Hank Kaplan. I don't know if you guys know who Hank Kaplan is. But Hank Kaplan knew more about boxing than anybody I ever met. Just an incredible boxing scholar, and he was an old man at the time I was talking to him. And we were talking about Roy Jones, and we were trying to come up with guys in history who we thought would beat Roy Jones. And we both came up with Mickey Walker, these very tenacious pressure fighters who could bang. And Hank Kaplan said to me, "Look, I can't tell you what it is, but here's the thing about Roy Jones. He is hiding a weakness that nobody has seen yet, but it's there, and it will be exploited one of these days. And once that happens, he's been hiding it all these years, and he's so good that nobody has seen it. But once that happens, it's all over for him." And to be honest, I couldn't see it at all. This shows how great Hank Kaplan was. And of course, it turned out to be his chin. And once that was exploited, all of his doubts came to the surface. And he went from being the best fighter in the world to being a guy who almost anybody on the right night could have knocked out. And I saw it after he got knocked out by Tarver. I saw the next fight from ringside, the next Tarver fight from ringside. And Roy Jones fought the whole fight not to get knocked out, not to win the fight. He never, as a matter, at one point, he had Tarver in trouble, and the old Roy Jones would have knocked him out. But he did nothing. And after the fight, he sort of proudly told the announcer, the guy who was doing the interview, "Well, I'm the second best light heavyweight in the world." It's sort of hard to imagine Roy Jones talking that way. So I think he now fights constantly with this fear that he's going to get knocked out.
Going back to sort of the Kovalev.
Sorry, Sam. Very quickly, Charles. It's funny you say that because Steve Collins obviously campaigned for a long time to get the Jones fight in the '90s, and even I think who was the guy when Jones fought that policeman? I can't remember who it was, but Steve Collins got in the ring afterwards in Florida and said sort of, "I'm right here," and he had that famous speech of Jones saying, "Where are they? Where are the challengers?" And Steve Collins is next to him saying, "I'm right here. I'm right here." And he has always insisted, even at the time and leading into now, that Jones was hiding, had a fear of getting hit, and if you could get to him, you would sort of mentally break him in that sense. And Collins, people said he was crazy at the time, or that he was just sort of talking bravado. But he's kind of been proven. Obviously, he never got the fight, but he's kind of been proven to be right in a sense. And I think that would have been a fascinating fight if Collins had gone into it completely believing that he could get to Jones.
Well, I mean, Collins was not an underconfident guy by any means, and except he wasn't much of a puncher, and he wasn't fast. So the question is, how could he have done it?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I just thought his kind of insistence on the. I think. Correct me if you don't agree, but I always felt there was a. It sounds so grandiose, but kind of a Tyson-like aura in terms of the way guys would get into the ring, and you could just see that they didn't believe they could win, especially with some of the HBO mismatches once he was established as their leading star. And like you say, it was 99% of the time because they couldn't win. There was no way they could win. But it would have been interesting, I think, to see a guy who absolutely believed he could and would if he could sort of expose this flaw in Jones's I guess in his makeup, really.
Well, you're right. Except he fought. I mean, for all the policemen and firemen, he fought. He also fought some really good fighters. He fought James Toney, who certainly had no confidence problems. And he had no trouble with James Toney. He fought Bernard Hopkins, who stylistically was not good for him, but he had no problem with I mean, we're talking, of course, the first time around. I don't know what his psychological makeup was back then. I can say that I was fooled. I thought that Roy Jones had everything. Obviously I was mistaken.
It's quite often where it's sort of a often stated, semi-truth by fans that if Jones had retired after beating Ruiz in when was that? Was that 2002 or 2001? But if he'd retired then, he would have gone down in history as one of the top 5 greatest ever. And I don't know if you quite put him that high up, but he would have been universally recognised as sort of the best of, I guess, the post. What would it be? The post Tyson era, I suppose, in terms of superstars.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I can't put him in anywhere close to the top 5, not because he didn't have the talent, but because there's no context that would allow any fighter fighting these days to be rated that highly, just because they don't have the number of fights, they don't have the kind of competition that they would need. But I certainly would say that Jones was the best of his era. And as you might know, I was partners with Pat Petronelli for many years, and of course, Pat Petronelli was one of Marvin Hagler's manager trainers. And to show you the kind of regard that Jones was held in, at one point, I said to Pat, I hate to say this because we're part of the same camp here, but I think that Jones would have handled Marvin. And Pat said, yeah, he might have. So that's the kind of esteem people even in the business were holding him in at one point. So yeah, I think if he'd retired after Ruiz, he would have had a really, really strong case as one of the very, very best ever.
Do you think his career's sort of been tainted by for how long he's gone on and the losses he's taken to guys he would have walked over previously?
It's a good question. I guess the answer to that is you have to decide when the guy's career is really over as a legitimate fighter, and then you have to discard everything that happens past that point. So, I think I'm willing to go, I don't know, about as far as the second Tarver fight to see him historically. And I'd say that everything past that, it is you have to sort of regard him as a different person. It's like Duran post 50 or something like that. I mean, there's a point where you say, all right, this is unfair. This isn't the same guy.
Hector Camacho fighting on his son's undercards when he was 55 or whatever and fighting at middleweight. Yeah,
right. Where does it stop?
You have to take it with a pinch of salt towards the end. I think I agree. Charles, can I ask you just quickly? We actually recently had a discussion about a month ago to do with underrated wins, and I'd be interested to see if you agree with this. The two that we came up with from the sort of recent eras were Hopkins knocking out Glenn Johnson in '97, I think it was, and then obviously Glenn Johnson spending the next 10 years or 15 years never getting knocked out again, as a sort of a win that looks better with time, if you know what I mean, one that ages well. And then the other one was, you just mentioned it a moment ago, the first Tarver fight for Jones, because obviously in the context of losing the second one so badly, people tend to forget about the first one. But knowing what we know now about how much damage it did to his body moving down, the fact that he was able to kind of to fight against a peak Tarver who was a good established world level fighter and beat him clearly. I actually think that win looks even better when you take into account what happened to him afterwards.
That's a great win because he could have lost that fight. It was up for grabs in the last couple of rounds, and he not only took the last couple of rounds, he intimidated Tarver to do it. So I thought that was very, very impressive. No, that's a great win.
It's strange. It kind of gets lost, doesn't it, in the because it's in the sort of no man's land between Jones being the pound for pound number one and Jones being a kind of a guy who's literally fighting fans in fairgrounds and stuff. And it's I do think it's we agreed that it was underrated. So glad we're not going completely mad. Can I ask you sort of moving on to another British I guess incident that we've had recently. It's been said, and I don't know if you agree with this or think it's true, that seeing what happened to Gerald McClellan, who was obviously a contemporary of Jones's,
right,
made him potentially more, I don't want to say safety first, because he really wasn't a safety first, but maybe a bit more cautious. And we've recently seen Nick Blackwell and Chris Eubank Jr. I don't know if you saw the fight.
I did.
And it's a shame because we all thought it was a really, really good fight up until about round 8, and then it seemed to go downhill very quickly. But we've all kind of seen the articles, and I don't know if they've been as far-reaching in the States, but they were all over the British newspapers for about a week afterwards saying, surely it's time to ban boxing, and all these sort of radio phone-ins and people who haven't seen a fight in 20 years saying that it's barbaric. And I was just wondering what your if you've got a stock answer, what it would be if someone comes up to you and says, why do you follow that barbaric sport? It should be outlawed.
It's a dangerous sport, and if you want to make an argument that it's an unethical sport and that people shouldn't participate in it, fair enough. That's okay. Bad things happen to almost every fighter, and I don't know that I can make an ethical argument for boxing, although there are plenty of ethical arguments you can make for there not being boxing. But boxers are adults and they make decisions. And although they're generally disenfranchised people, it's important to let them have the right to make that decision. Anything else is condescending and it's patronizing. Working at McDonald's is dangerous. You know, it's because of what it does to your life. Almost anything can be dangerous. Boxing is a dangerous business, and I think my decision, and this is very, very personal and very subjective, and I'm not saying this is right for anybody else, but at one point I thought, okay, you're either in or you're out. You're either in this thing or you're out of it. And if you're committed to it, you're committed to it with all of its bad elements. And one of its bad elements is that people get hurt in it. And there's nothing to be done about that. There is no answer for that. I thought that the Eubank Blackwell fight was, first of all, a very, very entertaining fight. Although Blackwell took a beating, I didn't see up until the end anything that suggested that he was in serious trouble in terms of his health. He didn't look, there was a point at which it didn't look like he was going to win the fight anymore. But I didn't see those kind of warning signs. I don't think that the referee did anything wrong. I think maybe if I were in Blackwell's corner, I might have pulled him out a little earlier, but not much. These things happen. And I think there's no real answer for it. I think if you find that boxing is objectionable, don't watch it. Don't pay for it. But it's always been around. It always will be around. And I think if we watch it, we either have to say yes or no, but not pretend that it's something that it isn't.
Do you think it's important for fans to, let's say I don't know, a teenager who's sort of just starting to enjoy boxing and watch it regularly? Would you say it was important for them to, as early as possible, kind of reconcile to the fact that at some point a fighter they know or a fighter they like is going to get very badly hurt?
It depends on the degree of involvement. If you make boxing, if boxing is a casual entertainment for you, watch it and don't think about it, I guess. I don't know, because I've never felt about it that way. But I think if you're committed to it, probably it's good information to know that almost no one leaves the sport whole, even people who appear to. That's the nature of the sport. But again, if you argue against it, there's something incredibly paternalistic about that, it seems to me. You're telling disenfranchised people what they can do and what they can't do with their lives. I don't know about you guys. I can't do that. I don't feel I have that right. But yeah, I think if you let people know that these guys aren't going to be the same 10 years, 15 years down the line, it's the truth. It's not maybe a bad thing to let people know the truth.
See the bit, back to Roy Jones, I blame him partially, but I think that HBO facilitated him quite a lot. They basically allowed him to fight on their channels against shite, instead of forcing him to maybe go to the UK or even try to pay the money to get the likes of Ben Eubank, maybe Watson. Maybe Watson was a wee bit too early, but they didn't help the situation here, but just constantly never forcing him to fight any guys. See when he did challenge himself about his early days, middleweight, and super middleweight, fighting with Tony.
Super middleweight, right? When he fought Tony.
He looks superb. My personal opinion is he in my generation, if I was born, he is the most talented boxer there's been. even more than Floyd, and I'm a massive Floyd fan. But his resume all in. I know he's achieved some right good things, like going up to heavyweight, but even then, he picked the weakest heavyweight. And I know he says that he was looking for the Mike Tyson fight, but at the same time, there were so many fighters that he actually ducked. He ducked a lineal champion at cruiserweight as well, didn't he? I can't remember the guy's name. He was for Germany.
Mikulczewski, you mean?
Yeah. And so there's
Charles, you might have an opinion on that. I always heard that was kind of half of one and half a dozen of one and six of the other sort of thing, where neither guy was that keen to fight the other one.
I think that neither guy was willing to go to the other guy's country. I think that's all it was. I don't think that Mikulczewski was willing to leave Germany, and why should he have? And I think that Jones was worried that he'd get robbed. At least that's what I was always told.
Yeah, which is a fair concern, I'd say. I think is it the case maybe that each guy was making enough money without the other? They sort of didn't need each other in that sense. They were both making, selling out arenas and making fantastic money in their own right.
Right. No, that's true. But I mean, I'm not sure I agree that Jones. Maybe there were European fighters he should have fought. I could see that. But the jump up to Ruiz, and you can make any case you want about him being the weakest of the champions, but that's an enormous jump, and to me that's a very, very courageous jump.
Surely, if it was that easy, I think a lot more people would do it, wouldn't they?
No, I don't disagree with that. I just think it was too few and far between for to see the talent that the guy possessed. He didn't do it often enough, but in the amount of fighters like Joe Calzaghe as well. Joe Calzaghe wanted that fight, and apparently Jones turned it down a couple of times, saying there's no money in that fight. Women want to take that fight for, and we're like, right, well, who are you actually fighting? And this is where I come back to HBO caused this problem, paying him so much money to fight shite when there was guys that were far better that he could have challenged himself. I mean, see the people that he could have fought, and I know people will cast up to me, but Floyd Mayweather didn't fight all the people that he could have, and I understand that, and I'm using Jones as an example. See if he fought some of the people that he could have, I would have him right high in the top 10, easy, without doubt, because there was some right good names that he could have fought, and he just chose not to do it. And it just seemed to be that once he took that loss, for some reason, he got a bit of bravado and he wanted to start taking the fights that he wasn't wanting to take earlier on. And it's weird because he'd already got a loss on his record. I know it was a disqualification, but he still had that. But it's as if he was just trying to protect that at 0, which he didn't have. And didn't want to challenge himself. And I know he went up to heavyweight, which was good. I thought what he'd done, going back down to light heavyweight, was a disaster. But I just think his career's a lot of what ifs. And we've obviously got like McClellan, where we all wanted that fight, and I know Ben got in the way of that, but that fight could have got made before then as well. It just seemed as if there was always an excuse to not make certain fights. It's just it was that was his career, and considering he's got a win over a prime Tony as well, you'd have thought he would have went on to far better things.
I think it says a lot when he's got wins over Hopkins, wins over a prime Hall of Fame. He's got wins over prime Hall of Fame guys, and yet we're still sitting here 10 years after his prime debating whether he could have done more, which I think shows you how talented he was, really.
How talented he was. Right? I mean, look, he did things. When he fought Mike McCallum, who clearly was past his best, he carried him. He made sure he didn't knock him out. That takes tremendous skill. But look, I mean, I can't disagree that every fighter can do more than they did, almost every fighter. And there were names that should have been on his resume one way or the other. I can't argue that.
See, my gripe's kind of coming here. I'm kind of drifting away from boxing because the politics. I think the politics have just got that bad. I don't really want to kind of sit and waste my time at weekends watching it. And I've got to the point now I'm sitting on YouTube and I went to the gym and I watched the Hagler Leonard fight. I've been sitting watching Duran like Hearns, just that, the people that were just wanting, like Duran was wanting to fight absolutely Andy, no matter what weight. He just wanted to challenge himself, and we don't get that now. Nobody wants to challenge herself, and I just like anytime I look back at Roy Jones' career, and I was like, why couldn't you have been like that? Because he had the I honestly believe that he could have wiped out Andy, run about his divisions. And he just didn't do it. And I've got to the point now I'm just watching hundreds of old fights because of this.
Well, but Duran is Duran, as they say in Panama. There is no one like him. I mean, Duran is fearless, and Duran's the best fighter of. I mean, I'm old enough.
He's the best Latino fighter of all time, isn't he?
Oh, I think I'm certainly the best Latino fighter of all time, but I think. You can make a case. I don't see him outside of the best 5 fighters of all time, in any division.
Top 5.
You do?
Yeah, top 5 of all time, and he's easily the best lightweight as well.
That's pretty. I agree that he's the best lightweight, but when you're talking about him being the best lightweight, you're saying that he's better than Benny Leonard and Joe Gans and
Armstrong.
Yeah.
Even guys like Mosley, I think that would have been, a prime sort of sugar-free Shane Mosley, as it were, against against Duran would have been amazing.
Charles, can I ask you where you rank the 4 kings in order of how you rated them as fighters, like Leonard, Hearns, Hagler, Duran? In what order would you put them?
And Benitez in there as well, because he always gets.
Yeah, great fighter. Of those, Duran number 1, no question about it. Leonard number 2, Hagler 3, Hearns 4, and Benitez. I mean, this is royalty. But
it's a hell of a list when you don't have Hearns in the top 3, isn't it?
Right. But I mean, there's no question that Duran is the best of that group.
I rewatched the Leonard Hagler fight at the weekend. Because I hate Ray Leonard. I've always had a bit of gripe with him. I don't know why. I honestly don't know why, but I've never ever liked him. So I'll rewatch the fight again, and I know there's a lot of controversy with that fight, but I had actually Leonard winning that clear, and I thought Hagler looked absolutely terrible in that fight, and I think I scored like 116, 112. So I don't know where the kind of controversy comes from. Did you think it was close?
Well, okay. 2 things. One, I got Ray at 4-1. Now I thought he was going to win anyway, but I did get 4-1. So I made $40,000 that night. So nice. I'm biased. But no, I thought Leonard won the fight clearly, and I expected him to win the fight. Obviously, I expected him to win the fight. I bet on him. But again, I can tell you some things about that fight too, because. As I said, Pat Petronelli was my business partner for a long time. And he said that Hagler was so sure that he was going to knock Ray out that even as the fight was taking place, he said that Marvin would come back to the corner and he'd say, the guy hits like a pussy. And it just didn't occur to him that the fight was going to go the distance. And I think maybe he also was so used to fighting 15-round fights that psychologically he thought he had 3 more rounds to work. And it just caught up to him. He just, the 12 rounds went by. Ray knows how to flurry. He knows how to save himself. And also, at that point, he was the bigger guy. So it's not like Hagler could outmuscle him so easily.
No, that's right, because Leonard pushed him off plenty of times.
Yeah. No, and he also had a style that was very, very difficult for Marvin.
He's hard to beat. He's the archetypal, just hard to beat fighter. It's a bit of a silly comparison. They're not on the same level at all. But I put James DeGale's a fighter I really like, just because I think he's incredibly hard to beat. Whether he will win against everyone, whether he can dominate fighters is another matter. But I always thought Leonard had obviously had all the skills, and the speed and the stamina and the conditioning. But he also had, like you say, those ways that the kind of, not gamesmanship, but the ability to flurry at the right moment and catch the eye of the judges, the ability to get out of trouble, like you said, which made him just unbelievably difficult to beat. And I think it's why, when I think about the highest level wins, I think we actually mentioned this on your first appearance, but Duran beating him when they were both at their absolute peaks is, in terms of the quality of kind of the action, in terms of how high a level both guys were operating at, it's right up there with sort of the fight of the century and, you know, some of the other classics.
No, that's right. That's right. It's one of the great performances ever. I mean, you know, Duran, there are a few of those. I mean, although obviously somebody like a Rand Barkley can't be compared to Ray Leonard. Duran moving up again, you know, at age 37, and then beating this enormous guy. I mean, because Barkley is one of the biggest middleweights I've ever seen.
Did you bet on that one?
I was there. I was actually in the crowd that night, but I did not bet on that one. But I was. There was a blizzard that night in Atlantic City, and I happened to be lucky enough to be sitting with a group of Panamanians, and it was just insane, just great.
It's a bit like I always think back. Well, not think back. Obviously, I wasn't there, but whenever I watch it on YouTube, the Davey Moore Duran fight, you can sort of see the crowd are a little bit nervous, and then after about a minute and a half the arena's just on its feet, and they can see that they can sort of they can almost smell what's coming. Do you know what I mean? And they can see that Duran is just in that zone where he's just not going to be denied. And yes, he was unbelievable once he got onto that level.
Well, also, you know, again, this is something that not everyone will agree with, but for example, with Davey Moore, Duran was one of the smartest fighters I ever saw. Well, what do I do? I'm going to take his eye out. That's the first thing I want to do. I'm going to disable him. So he uses his thumb, and by the end of the first round, you know, Davey Moore can't see out of one eye. You know, you could say that's bad, that's good, that's a judgment for other people, but he knew what to do. You know, it's just a very, very tough man. And
I think he's the sort of guy, if you were sort of in a dark alley, you'd want him next to you. He could handle himself, yeah, like you say, illegally or legally. Can I ask, Charles, just moving on a little bit towards the weekend, if looking ahead to Pacquiao Bradley, and also looking back, and I know we'll get onto Teddy Atlas in a moment because I know you've got thoughts on him, but I was wondering how you see the fight going. The Pacquiao Bradley fight, and whether you're excited for it first of all, or whether you see it as a kind of needless rematch.
I'm not overly excited about it. I wasn't particularly excited about the second one. I mean, you know, the first one was won so convincingly by Pacquiao, you know, irrespective of the decision, that I didn't think there was much to prove. I'll tell you though, I think that as a fight, this might be the most interesting of the three, because there are so many questions that we don't know the answers to. I mean, how much has Pacquiao lost? That's the first question. And, you know, as I've mentioned before, you know, I thought that Bradley was pretty close to done before his last fight with Rios, but he, for whatever reason, looked good against Rios. So, you know, are we talking about a kind of reinvigorated Bradley against an old Pacquiao? And if that's the case,
the case, will you be praising Teddy Atlas like they seem to be doing on HBO so much these days?
You know, I'm going to try and keep an open mind about his performance. Atlas's, but Atlas is a guy I frankly don't like. I don't think he's a good trainer. I don't think he knows much about boxing. I think he's done a lot of his fighters a lot of harm, but I can't argue with the results of the last fight. That we're firemen's bullshit. I hate that stuff. I really do. I think that's got, and the idea of the celebrity trainer drives me nuts. Atlas is really sort of the first name in self-aggrandizing celebrity trainers.
It's very interesting you say that, because there was a sort of brief segment on HBO that they've been talking about where Freddie Roach had used the line about how he was from the Eddie Futch school and had come up under that kind of that philosophical umbrella, I suppose, within boxing. And Teddy Atlas was much more from the Customado school. Obviously, they worked together. And I don't know if A, you agree with that, B, if you think that's really overblowing and overstating Atlas's abilities. And also, interesting to note that Roach, in the same breath, also pointed out that he thought he was very quick to say, look, Eddie Futch wasn't a celebrity trainer. You know, there was no such thing back then, and it's not the most productive kind of label that we've created. It tends to distract from what's really going on in the fights.
Although, you know, Roach himself has benefited from it probably more than anyone in boxing history. You know, he's undoubtedly the wealthiest trainer who ever lived, and it's because he's a celebrity trainer. So, but you know,
in terms of kind of the schools of training, I suppose what your I mean, I don't know if you ever had dealings with Futch or Customado when you were in the game, so to speak.
I had dealings with Futch. I never met D'Amato, although of course Floyd Patterson was my business partner too, and trained my fighters. So I have a kind of indirect link to D'Amato, but I don't think Customado was a good trainer. You know, and so what redounds from D'Amato doesn't impress me at all. You know, Eddie Futch was a good trainer. I don't think he's as good as he's made out to be, but he was a good boxing thinker, and he got his guys into good condition. And the way I knew Eddie Futch was because I used to send my fighter Tyrone Booz to spar. He was Riddick Bowe's chief sparring partner, and I got a call from Eddie asking me if he could train Tyrone Booz, which shocked me, to be honest, because Tyrone was getting up there in years and, you know, had a kind of spotty record and was a good fighter, but not a star fighter. So I got to know Eddie Futch a little bit, and I think he was a really, really solid trainer. And I think that Roach is a journeyman trainer who comes out of that school. I don't think that Atlas comes out of any school at all. You know, the fact that he's connected with D'Amato wasn't a good trainer. You know, he was a philosopher of whatever value you want to ascribe to him. But you know, I think that this thing with the two trainers is really something that HBO can sell, but doesn't have a whole lot of merit in terms of pure boxing value.
So you really wouldn't put Roach or Atlas on the same pedestal as a guy like Nacho Berenstein, who I know you're a big fan of.
Big fan of. No, I wouldn't put Atlas anywhere. I mean, Atlas to me is not a professional level fight trainer. You know, he gets big names because he came in with Tyson, and that established him. And since, you know, he's like Kevin Rooney, you know, they got brought in on a guy who could sell the entire business. You know, no, Roach is nowhere near the best trainer in the world nowadays, and you know, he's okay, nothing wrong with him, but what he does is very functional. He's not particularly creative. As a lot of people have pointed out, he hasn't brought a fighter up from the ground up. You know, a guy like Jesse Reed, who is not nearly as high profile these days, is a much, much better trainer than Freddie Roach. And yeah, I mean, to me, Nacho Berenstein, you know, is more along the tradition of Whitey Bimstein and Charlie Goldman, you know, and Freddie Brown and Ray Arcel. Those guys really understood training.
And
you know, Georgie Benton.
Sorry, Charles. Of course, Berenstein's a guy who spent sort of a combined probably 40 years with the Marquez brothers, for example, in terms of training them from when they were children almost up to world title level. Can we go back to another one you mentioned earlier, who I think is very much in the conversation now, and his stock seems to be rising all the time, is John David Jackson. I was wondering what you thought of him as a trainer. He seems to be really improving.
I like him a lot. I think that John David Jackson is technically pretty sound, connects really well with his fighters, and has a pretty good understanding of how to modify what they can do to best suit them. So, I mean, I think he's done great work with Kovalev. Great work. I like him.
Charles, there's another podcast that Alex, who on here, he does another podcast as well called The Boxing Asylum. They had a guest on called Jonathan Butler. Right, he's a boxing author, and he's a massive Regal fan as well. He's went to like kind of Cuba and done research on him. But see one of the stories that he's basically come out with. He's and I asked Sam to ask you this question before when you were on, but I don't think to get around to it. He's basically kind of cast up accusations towards like Customato, basically saying that there's something maybe a little bit sinister with regards to his personal life with young black boxers, and they said that it was also he thought that he was a closet homosexual. Was there any actually rumours like going about that? Because like, nobody could actually find any truth to this, and it was questioned. So I asked Sam to ask you before this, but we couldn't get around to asking you.
I think that a bunch of the guys associated with that Catskill group were a bunch of chicken hawks. I do. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I know that, again, you know, Floyd Patterson was never came out and said this exactly, but he insinuated that there were a lot of very strange things about Customato.
Yeah, that's where like some of his theories came through. I think, like he said, that his dad was like a psychiatrist or something like that, so he's worked in that kind of field. So he was being brought up with that, and he says that the way Tyson acted as well, with regards to his outbursts and how what he came out with says.
It was the "fuck me till you love me" faggot line, wasn't it?
Yeah, he says there's basically telltale signs that something maybe went on when he was younger, and this was just basically shy stuff. Him spouting out stuff that he'd heard or his experience when he was younger, and this was like he kind of basically noticed that. But he says that with Floyd Patterson saying that he kind of slept in the same bed as him as well. Was that's true, isn't it?
That's what I've been told. Yeah, I believe it. And I think, as I said, I think that a number of the Catskill group that preyed upon young guys.
Is there a reason why like nobody's actually chased up this story, or is it just basically like boxing's that much a clique that nobody wants to get near it?
That's a good question. I mean, you know, I think there are things that boxing fans don't want to hear about these guys who are seen as kind of quintessentially macho, right? I mean, it always interests me that you know, the worst thing you can call of a guy in boxing is a faggot. And you know, then they well, what about Emil Griffith? Well, no, that's okay. That doesn't count. Well, does it count or does it not count? I mean, you know, one should have nothing to do with the other, but it does. And so there are things that people don't want boxers to be associated with. Well, but they're people.
He interviewed Tyson not long ago, and people were asking him, why didn't you just ask Tyson that? And he's basically saying, no, it's not a question you can just outright come out and ask like an ex-pro heavyweight boxer. Were you molested as a child with your boxing trainer? So it's good that actually you've come out and you've actually heard like similar stories as well.
You know, I don't want to get. You know, there are things I could probably be accused of libel for, so I have to be a little careful here too. But you know, I've heard stories, and they're from people I trust, about people I know, and you know, with that camp, and all I can say is I believe the stories.
All right, cheers for answering that.
Charles, on a slightly lighter note to finish before we go down the rabbit hole any further, I have a couple of questions, a couple of sort of more general questions, more kind of brain teasers really, because
Sure.
we were discussing, I sort of jumped in on your conversation at the weekend to do with naturally gifted fighters, and not in terms of kind of someone like Floyd, who's obviously phenomenally naturally gifted, but also had thousands and thousands of hours of training. But in terms of guys who take to it incredibly quickly, and you're sort of left wondering, okay, if they'd had the same kind of run-up as the other guys did, or if they'd been from a different part of the world or wherever it might be, how good could they have been? And we came up with Sergio Martinez, obviously, as a guy who really had no ceiling if he'd had the same level of training as some of the other guys. And we had this debate on the pod the other week in terms of guys who've got to, either the very highest level or close to it, just despite spending comparatively almost no time with the sport at all, or not really enjoying it to the extent that others have. And I was wondering if you ever came across any like that in your career, or if there were any that stood out to you in the current landscape.
Well, I mean, I can name a few who, I mean, we talked about him earlier. Benitez never worked at all, and Benitez was unbelievably gifted. But recently, I don't know how much Edwin Valero was disciplined, but I mean, he was a guy who had great talent. Fairly recently retired. I don't know how. I'm sure you all know Joan Guzman.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, we talked about him before when you were on, didn't we? You mentioned how you'd love to have promoted him. Just
incredible talent. We also talked about Guillermo Jones, who I think, is a guy who just walks into the ring and can beat anybody at the weight. There was a guy a few years ago who I thought he didn't take it seriously at all. He was a welterweight named Jose Lopez, who was a champion for a while and I think went to a draw with Ike Corte. And this was a guy who just hung out on the beach and got high all the time. That's all he liked to do. And didn't train and just could fight his ass off.
Are you familiar? And again, sorry if this is patronising, but are you familiar with a guy called Leon Taylor, who was a sort of contender, late '80s, early '90s? I think he was a middleweight in New York. Because he's always talked about as kind of within, on the boxing forums and stuff, as being the kind of guy who, the urban legend is that he didn't fight for a year, then he got it cool on sort of 2 days' notice, and he fought an undefeated Golden Gloves guy and sort of won every round, and he'd fly to France, still drunk, to sort of take on a local champion, and then end up sort of taking them the distance against a much larger guy. And I think he only ended up having about 14 professional fights, but he's always, and his record, his record doesn't look great, sort of 14 wins, 3 losses, and a few draws. But he was a guy who'd sort of not go into a gym for a year, then come back in and sort of school the best guy in there who'd spent every day training. And I don't. Are you familiar with him? I think only one. I've only ever found a couple of his fights. Sort of.
I think he's a cruiserweight, wasn't he?
Yes, I think. Yeah, I think so.
I remember. Yeah, I remember him. He was like.
He was
this incredible natural. He couldn't punch much. But he was. I remember he was this completely relaxed fighter. He was totally relaxed all the time. And he'd fight anybody. That's sort of all I remember of him. He tended to come out on the losing end of decisions, but he was completely fearless.
And he's the sort of the type who always gets talked about as being one of those. He did it all on natural talent, basically. Had almost no training, no discipline at all. The other two that we came up with together, and I'll be interested to see if you agree, in terms of very recent and modern fighters. We came up with Marcos Maidana, for one, who came to the sport very late and, famously barely trained for sort of the Amir Khan fight or these various, beat a guy like Ortiz when Ortiz had probably, thousands more hours in the gym, refining his technique and all this sort of thing, and ended up, ultimately fighting Floyd Mayweather twice. And if you look at those two in terms of the comparative effort and time they've put into the sport, it wouldn't be even anywhere close. So I always thought he was a guy who got there almost entirely on sort of natural toughness and grit.
I think that's true, but no, I don't argue with that. I think that's right. The thing about Maidana too, though, is that he's a very, very good puncher, and in terms of guys who don't work hard, in a sense, punchers have an edge, especially if they're willing to let their hands go. So you can get pretty untutored punchers who can do a lot better than they should, just because if they hit you, they can hurt you. But yeah, I think Madonna, probably fits that description.
The other one we came up with was, might sound slightly strange, but Chavez Jr., just in terms of a guy who just has no work ethic at all, and has basically, I know he's kind of ridden on his father's name, but he's got a lot of wins just purely through genetics, it seems, and just being sort of a tough guy who seemed to...
and drugs, to be fair, PEDs and diuretics and all the rest.
Well, yeah, potentially as he's got older, I think maybe, but a guy who seems to have probably not listened to his trainer once in his entire career, and yet got very far in the sport. Whether that's good or not, I don't know. If it sends a good message. And Charles, just as a final sort of serious question on that subject,
sure.
Did you see Broner in his most recent fight? I know we're kind of loath to talk about him because his career is not really serious anymore. But if you have any thoughts on Broner and whether he sort of serves as a lesson to any other fighters who might be coming through.
Well, I mean, if he serves as a lesson, I think the lesson has yet to make itself clear because we don't know what's going to happen with him. I mean, the deal with Broner for me is that whatever talent he has, and I'm not saying he doesn't have talent, he doesn't know how to fight. He has absolutely no idea how to fight. And, what he does now is a kind of anti-fighting. I mean, the other night, he was handed as easy a win as he could possibly have been handed. So that fight means nothing whatsoever. But, he's my guess. I could be completely wrong about this. It looks to me as if they're building up, this animosity, this feud, so that he can fight Floyd Mayweather. And if that's the case, how he wound up doing with what he's got is you sort of can't argue with it. I mean, I don't like the guy at all, and I think he's a terrible fighter. I think he has not a clue as to how to fight, and he doesn't listen to anybody, so he's never going to learn how to fight. But he's in this strange situation.
Well, when you say he doesn't know how to fight, do you mean kind of in terms of coping with crisis in the ring and things like that?
He certainly doesn't do that well, but he also has no technique whatsoever. He's a guy who fights second to second. There's no ring intelligence, no IQ whatsoever. He can't put a fight plan together. What he's got are, very good reflexes and fast hands, and he's comfortable enough so that even if he doesn't train, he can go rounds. But he doesn't have a clue as to how to defend himself. I mean, in the Sean Porter fight, I mean, granted he scored a knockdown, but really what he tried to do is talk his way out of fighting for the entire time. I mean, he really got beaten up. And, the same thing with Maidana. When Maidana pushed him, he didn't have a clue. He just let himself get beat up. That was embarrassing. I mean, a guy who actually knows how to box would have been able to figure out how to do something there. But, all he did was hang around the whole time and get beat up. So, I mean, he's got no ring intelligence whatsoever. But I think he's going to walk into fill in the blanks, whatever he'll get paid to fight Floyd. And it's an incredibly brilliant promotion because he doesn't have to be competitive. People are going to pay to watch him get beat up.
Yeah, I mean, really, he could almost not even have a training camp, couldn't he? People wouldn't mind at all. They wouldn't go into it expecting a competitive fight or expecting him to test Floyd in any way. Yeah, it's very, very easy money if you can get it, I suppose.
Sorry, see with regards to Floyd, do you think he's going to come back? Me personally, I think that he's waiting until the weekend. I think he's maybe hoping that Pacquiao maybe knocks out Bradley, which I'm picking I'm picking Pacquiao to absolutely waste Bradley. I think he's hoping that maybe Pacquiao looks that good that people will buy into the story that he was injured last year and they'll buy into this fight again. I really do think there will be a second fight. I can't see him just walking away at 49 and just leaving it at that, especially because he's obsessed with money, and this will still get him the best part of $50 to $100 million.
No, I mean he's certainly going to fight again. There's no question about it. I think he could be watching Pacquiao. I think that's very realistic. Yeah, if Pacquiao scores a knockout, or it almost doesn't matter how he wins. But I think they've already got the Broner fight on the back burner. I think it's already set up.
Russ, the thing I said to him last week. The thing with that is, like, Broner's not any good, and the two of them have got the same set of fans. So it's not as if he's going to get like the South American fan base to support that fight, and it would absolutely bomb. It would cost Showtime an absolute fortune.
I think your casual would.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Charles. No, carry on.
No, please go ahead.
I think your casual would tune in just to see Broner get beat there because he's such a dislikable bloke. People will just tune in to see him lose.
No, but they're both dislikable, aren't they?
Exactly.
No, but Floyd won't be playing the heel, for example. He'll make a he'll make a face turn.
That's exactly it. That's exactly what's going to happen, of course. And the thing is, people are saying, well, why won't Floyd be in a competitive fight? Now, who can he fight? I mean, he can fight. He's never going to fight Golovkin. That's never going to happen. I don't think he'll fight Canelo again because the risk-reward doesn't play to it. But if he fights Broner, nobody's going to care that it's not competitive. I mean, they're going to hope it's not competitive. That's the beautiful part about the promotion. I mean, people are going to pay specifically to watch this guy get beat up. That's it. So it's going to be marketed entirely to casual fans. Who'll buy it, by the way, because both these guys can talk.
Charles, the way...
Sorry, Sam. Very quickly, one sec. Charles, we're having very similar in the UK at the moment, where a certain heavyweight you might be familiar with called Shannon Briggs just keeps showing up at every single press conference, and it's really, honestly, it's really trying our patience because again, he'll get thrown into fights and it will just be novelty. No one will expect him to be competitive, and I guess in a way it's brilliant promotion and matchmaking because people are willingly paying to see a foregone conclusion, but at the same time, you do get the sense that you're being treated with a bit of contempt by the powers that be.
No, I mean that's Shannon Briggs is a 47-year-old man whose idea of training, is to juice and do a couple of arm curls, and that's been true for 15 years. But look, more power to him. I'm told that he and David Hay are kind of, circling around each other as a potential fight. And my guess is it'll sell, right?
Oh, it will. All the casuals here are going fucking crazy for Briggs and his antics.
More power to him. It's it's a tough world, man. If he can do it that way, and the funny thing, of course, with Briggs is for 90 seconds, maybe even one round, he's a little bit dangerous. I mean, that guy can punch.
That's all he's got there, isn't it?
If you go into a fight and your only option is just to try and hit him with a one-punch winner, what's the point of it?
Yeah. No, I agree. You're right.
Can I ask you about what you think about the Canelo Khan fight, and do you think that's just a waste of time as well?
Well, again, I think it's brilliant marketing. I give Amir Khan all kinds of respect for making a really smart business decision. To fight a fight that there's no lose in it for him. Nothing. All he can do is win. There's a built-in storyline for when he gets knocked out, and it's completely plausible. It's not going to hurt him. It's not going to get in the way of his having other money fights, with Kell Brook or something like that. As a fight, it's nothing. It's a completely one-sided fight, and Canelo's going to beat him up for 7 or 8 rounds, and that will be the end of it. I mean, Conor will never be in the fight. But I still respect him doing it. I think it's very, very smart business.
Yeah, we got into a heated debate about this between ourselves. Why Khan took it, and you sided with not my side of the debate.
What's yours? Tell me what your side of it is.
I can't remember what I was saying now. I was more winding up Ainsley, to be honest, than actually, because he says he's not, but he's a massive Brook fan and he hates anything Khan. So I kind of like prod him a bit with that, but I kind of forgot what I was saying to him now. But you sided with him, so I'll be happy to listen to this.
I think the British fans, Charles, are kind of split in terms of a lot of them want to see the Brook Khan fight, but at the same time they're really sick of Brook's complete refusal to fight anyone else, and putting all his eggs in one basket in a sense. So people are kind of divided. We debate it on the pod all the time whether we'd rather see Khan Canelo or whether we'd rather see Khan against Brook. And I think, to be honest, I'd rather see, if Khan's going to get knocked out, I'd rather see him go to Vegas and they put on a great undercard and it'd be a real sort of box office show. Because we haven't really had a fighter do that since Ricky Hatton, really, in terms of going over there and kind of stealing the show in that sense for a weekend.
Yeah, it'll be a lot of fun. It'll be a really entertaining fight. And when he fights Brook, he's gonna. I mean, I think if anything, that's going to be a more decisive knockout than the Alvarez knockout, just because of styles.
I think it's a very tough fight for Khan. I agree with you.
Oh yeah, no, impossible. I mean, Kell Brook is the genuine article. What he's going to do, I don't know, but he's really gifted.
Who would you like to see him square off against in terms of and do you think there are any real? We're constantly having this debate about whether he needs to sign with Heyman basically and go to America, or we suggested on Monday's show that he should be ringside for Bradley Pacquiao. He should be trying to get into the ring after the fight. He should be really trying to put himself in the frame. And
people are largely ignoring him, aren't they? Basically, in America, I think that he's a bit of an afterthought.
I'm not sure why. I think you're right, but I don't get it. He's a quality fighter. I mean, the fight I would like to see, and I think they could make a lot of money. I think I've mentioned it's probably a year down the line. Is have him fight Terence Crawford. I would love to see that fight.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Crawford, strangely, I think, I don't know if you agree, I think sometimes I don't think he reacts that well to getting hit. I think he can sometimes freeze momentarily as well. Although he does seem to have very good recovery, which I think is to do with his conditioning, isn't it? But
well, it seems that Crawford's going to be lined up for the Apostle fight. I mean, how do you see that going?
All Crawford.
All Crawford.
Yeah. Because Postle's big thing is, he's well conditioned, and but he's very orthodox, very methodical. A guy like Crawford can come in and out, can fight him on the inside and rough him up and then get out. I don't see that fight as being a very difficult fight for Crawford at all.
And Lomachenko-Walters, how do you see that one?
Great fight. That's a really good fight. I think I'm going to go with Walters, although I could well be wrong, and I'm saying that based on size and power. But he may not look good doing it, while it's happening. I mean, I think he's probably going to get outboxed early, but I think maybe his physicality in the end will be too much for Lomachenko. I mean, that's how Lomachenko lost his first fight to Salita. Just physicality did him in, and if that's true with Salita, Walters is bigger, stronger, punches much harder.
And goes to the body very well, doesn't he?
Goes to the body very well. There's a guy who's a real natural. I mean, we're talking about people with natural talent. He's one of them. And I don't think that Lomachenko has quite adapted to the pros yet, and maybe he's too old to at this point. He's talented, but he doesn't punch very hard, and he uses up a lot of energy that he probably would need in a demanding fight like that.
Do you not think he could be a more powerful puncher if he was sitting down on his shots more? Because he seems to constantly be on the move. He's always moving around the target. He's never stationary.
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure if he could be, but I think that his style is at this point pretty much established, and I'm not sure that you're going to see him be a whole lot different. I mean, he had all of those amateur fights, and he doesn't have a good trainer. His father should not be training him. So my sense is that what you're seeing is what you're going to get with him. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, just to finish off, I had a conundrum for you. This was famously asked to Dan Rayfield, and he gave an answer that just made absolutely no sense at all. Okay, I'll give you a hypothetical situation. Roy Jones, Bernard Hopkins, Manny Pacquiao, Juan Manuel Marquez, and Vladimir Klitschko all have their final fights this year. Which three go into the Hall of Fame on the first ballot?
Okay, and I'm confined to three?
Yes, yeah. There's no. Dan Raphael's reply was all of them are first ballot Hall of Famers.
Right.
Painful to read. He refused to only pick three. It was quite irritating. But yeah. So sorry, you're stuck with the
I'm stuck with three. Okay.
Hall of Fame rules.
All right. So the first who goes out is Klitschko. Klitschko has no business being in the same conversation with the other four. And then, at his best, Jones was the best of the group, but he's the other one I'd exclude. I would go with Pacquiao, Marquez, and Hopkins.
Amazing to think that because feasibly all of those five could retire. They could have their last fights this year. I know Marquez has said he wants one more, Hopkins wants one more, etc. And it's crazy to think that Jones could potentially miss out.
Well, I mean,
I think they'd make an exception. I think
they'd make an exception. And the one who they would keep out in this sense, Jones would go in, and the one they would keep out would be Marquez.
Yes, I agree with that. I think to their detriment, I think they'd go with that.
If you put Pacquiao in, Marquez's resume may not be quite as strong, but it's very close. He's never been knocked out. He's fought tough guys his whole life. He's still going. I think he's got to be a first call guy.
Yeah, you'd like to think that they find a way to get them all in. But having said that, I do quite like the three strikes rule because it sort of forces you to make tough decisions, which I think is sometimes necessary. And of course, you could have someone like Cotto in there as well, who might have his final fight this year as well. So,
well, the big question. Here's the question that I asked then: who will actually go in? I mean, forget about what any of us think.
Roy Jones.
Got three. Who makes it? I mean, it would be.
I think Jones, Hopkins, Pacquiao. I agree with you. I think those three would get picked first.
And they keep Klitschko out. Well, that's good. I mean,
You could have Floyd really as well go if he fights again this year. He won't fight again after he has to go to 50-0, will he? So there's another one.
In which case, it would be Floyd, Jones, and Pacquiao. I think. Those
right.
The biggest icons.
The Hopkins supporters are going to have a lot to say about that one.
I would personally have Hopkins in there instead of Jones, but I think Jones would get in because I think he's a bit more popular among the people that actually vote for this thing.
I think Jones and Hopkins being alongside each other is brilliant because it shows how diverse the criteria are in terms of judging great fighters and how there are different ways to be great, which I think is brilliant. And they're not all sort of carbon copies of each other.
When does Tony become eligible?
When was his last fight?
I think he fought last year.
Okay, because I mean, it would be interesting if the three of them wound up. I mean, obviously they're not going to be on the ballot the same year first year, but I'd love to see the three of them. Who do you choose between those three?
Somebody says to me earlier on that he's going to fight in Canada shortly.
What, Tony?
Yeah.
He's looking for a fight. He's always said that he wants to get to 100 fights and then retire.
Jesus
He's
Christ.
on something like 79 at the moment. Something.
That's a casualty waiting to happen there.
Yeah,
Oh my God, yeah.
he was talking about it on Twitter constantly a couple of years. It was when he was doing Prize Fighter. He was saying, "Look, I want to get to 100 fights. That's my only mission."
Charles, can I ask you, in all your time in boxing, who was the most intimidating people you had dealings with, be they boxers or the sort of murky individuals that hang around the sport?
Well, I was on Al Braverman's side, so in that sense, he wasn't intimidating. But if it weren't for that, he might be. The scariest fighters are guys who you'd never have heard of. They were club fighters, or and from the deep South who just got out of jail, and everything is about money and kind of mistrust. So, the thing you'd have to worry about with them is whether or not there'd be a misunderstanding and they'd shoot you. So, guys like that were really much scarier. I managed, and Mitch Green for years, and everyone thinks Mitch Green is this intimidating guy, and I never thought that at all. So, in the real world, it's not about who can beat whom in the ring. It's about who's going to shoot you in the alley afterwards.
Did you ever fear for yourself around some of these guys? Because, like, in all effects, they are like trained killers, really, aren't they? They could do you serious damage if they wanted to.
Well, they have a gun as well. So.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, they have a gun as well. Yeah. Look, I mean, there are separate issues. There were issues of business where I dealt with guys with whom I had disagreements, and those guys scared me to death. But in terms of fighters, the fighter who scared me the most was a friend of mine. Do you guys know who Robbie Sims was? He was Marvin Hagler's brother. I don't know if
no, I'm not familiar.
Okay, he's Marvin Hagler's half brother, and he was a very good middleweight. I mean, he beat Duran. Tough guy. I mean, he's tough the same way, in many ways the same way that Marvin is, just not nearly as good. But he and I were really, really close friends. And he asked me for some business advice at one point. He wanted to go into the music business. And he was, he would have lost a lot of money doing it. He wanted to open up a record label. And it's a business I know a little bit about. And I said to him, no, you shouldn't do it. You're gonna lose a lot of money, and it's a mistake. And he really took it the wrong way. And he got very angry. And I thought, wow, I don't know what's about to happen to me, but I'm going to come in second in this thing. And he made me pretty nervous.
He's actually got a loss to Nigel Benn. I didn't know that.
I was just looking at that.
We look like a bunch of casuals now because we didn't know who he was.
No, this is from years and years ago.
Nigel Benn fought him after the Eubank loss, the knockout.
Charles, we usually like to try and sort of finish with predictions for the weekend. So can I fire off a few of the fights at the weekend for you and get a snap prediction?
Please do.
Right, so obviously Bradley Pacquiao, what's your, if you were a betting man, how would you go with that one?
A very, very shaky bet for Pacquiao. Very shaky.
Presumably on points.
Yes.
Okay, Abraham against Ramirez. I think that one could be controversial.
That's, again, a very, very tough fight. Abraham is about ready to go, isn't he? He's very close to being. Maybe we'll go with the upset on that one, and go with Ramirez.
I think Abraham is ready to go, but I'm really not that strong in a believer in Ramirez. I don't think he's that good. I think it could be a really ugly, close fight, in which he gets the decision. I agree with you. The Aram guy in Las Vegas, and then who else have we got on the undercard? Valdez against Gradovic. I think that's going to be a bit of a showcase in the end.
You think Valdez is going to is going to be made to look good?
I think so. I think it could be a sort of 5 or 6 round real beatdown.
That sounds right to me. Yes.
And thank you for agreeing. And then finally, and obviously, you think Joshua? Do you think it's an early stoppage or?
Yes. Yes, I do. I think it's over by the 5th round.
I think that's sound. Yeah, I agree with you. I'd love Martin to pull the upset, but I just can't see any way it happens.
You know, he just doesn't have anything. I mean, you know, if he pulls the upset, it says something really bad about Joshua, about what his future can be.
Yes,
He's not supposed to lose.
he'd need to show a serious flaw, wouldn't he, to lose?
Yeah. I mean, the only way he could lose is if he got knocked out, and if he got knocked out by a guy like Charles Martin, that would put his career in real jeopardy.
I agree with that. And on the we love to hate on the hype fighters in Joshua and in the UK. So I think on the note of his career going into jeopardy, Charles, thank you very much for coming back on. It was brilliant to talk to you again. And I'm sure we'll have even more questions. So we may even have to drag you on a third time in the future. Possibly closer to Canelo Khan if you have time at all.
Always be my pleasure. This has been so much fun.
Thank you very much again, Charles. And if you've got any other comments or questions, jump in.
No, just thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it, guys.
There was something I wanted to ask at one point, but I forgot what it was, and it'll bug me, but it'll come to me later. It's probably nonsense anyway if it was coming from me, to be fair. So
I doubt that. Email me.
Thanks again, Charles, and we will speak again soon.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.